Welcome to How to Pay for College Without Going Broke. My company is called Crystal Clear College Planning. And a little bit of background on me. My name is Crystal Tate, and I put myself through school. I went to Western and I graduated with a degree in finance. And I understand the challenges involved in this process. I didn't have help from my parents in going through this, and I wish that I had known then what I do now on how to pick the best college academically and then also how to plan to pay for it. That is why I love what I do in helping families through this process so that they don't have to struggle like I did. What we do is build a strategic plan to help you through the admissions process, as well as build a college funding plan so you know how to cash flow the cost of education and make sure that you're not paying more for college than you have to. After I graduated from Western, I was working with a small financial planning company in Linwood, and I was doing retirement plans and data entry and tracking client business. Now, this is not nearly as fun as it might sound. So after a few years there, the people that I worked with shared with me the opportunity of becoming a college funding and admissions specialist. And I am extremely grateful to them for sharing with me the resources to make this business happen. I am working with a great team that has been doing college planning for over 20 years, and I am so excited to share with you some great information. I would also like to mention that we do have live classes as well. So to check out those dates or to share that with friends and family, you can visit my website at collegefinancingcoach.com under the classes tab. And then also, if you've signed up for my email newsletter, we do send out information every month on classes coming up. And then we also post those to Facebook. So what we're going to talk about today is this public versus private school conversation, because I tend to hear two things from families. One, private school is just too expensive, so Crystal, we're not even going to consider it. Or two, some kids actually don't think that they're smart enough to go to a private school, so we're just going to talk about how, if it is a fit for you, it can be a possibility. And then the two big components of this are what we call student positioning and financial positioning. So we're going to take all that stuff that makes up our kid, and we're going to talk about how best we can position ourselves financially to maximize getting the best discounts in this process. And then we're going to put it all together with some case studies so you can see how that all goes. But I do like to give you a big picture in regards to how much college costs. This is on average per year and all in. So tuition, room and board, books, miscellaneous expenses. At a public school right now, the average across the country is about $27,000 a year. Now, of course, this can vary because at University of Washington, it's closer to about $29,000 a year. But then when we start to look at some of those out-of-state schools, like the UC schools, some of those are about $65,000 a year. Now, for an average private school, and I talk about this more as like the normal private schools, our all-in cost for those per year is about $45,000. But this is really what we call sticker price. Nobody likes to pay sticker price for things, but this is starting to recognize too that just because it looks like it costs $65,000 a year doesn't always mean that that's going to be the case. And we do have some of those elite universities are between $70,000 and $80,000 a year. And that is one of those primary reasons we do talk about college costs, because it does go up and we really want to make sure that we're best positioned in order to bring it down. Now, first, though, I like to talk about the private versus public schools. And here we always tell people that they should look at what is the goal of an institution. So when we talk about the big state schools like a University of Washington, it's a great school, but they do have a lot of money that they use to do research and other stuff that can be more focused on their graduate level students and maybe not as much on their undergraduates. And how we see this play out a lot of times too is this weeding out versus a helping a students to succeed philosophy. So at University of Washington, those introductory classes, you could have maybe up to 600 kids in some of those. And the professor is going to say, you know what, you guys are all qualified and you got here, but just based on statistics, 1/3 of you won't make it through my class. So they're really weeding kids out at the very beginning on who's going to make it through. On the flip side, often small to mid-sized private schools or even some of the state schools, we tend to not have that be as much of an issue. You tend to have smaller class sizes, the professor actually teaching the class, and more accountability just in general. So I always go back to, well, what kind of student do you have? If your kid's a 4.0 student, they may do well no matter where they go. But sometimes when we're that average kid or below average kid, walking into that huge UW sized classroom may not set them up for success to get in and out of college in 4 years. So really going back to what is that best fit is important. And then a lot of this does come back down to graduation rates, because we could spend a lot of time and a lot of money going to school and we don't necessarily come out with that diploma. So I always like to give you an idea of what's going on in the state of Washington right now when it comes to graduation rates. So Eastern Washington has 53% of their kids graduating in 6 years. And then Seattle Pacific on the flip side has 68% that are getting out in just 4. Really, I want to know how much this is going to cost me by the time I'm done. So at Eastern, it's $23,000 a year. We go there for 6 years. We spend $138,000. We don't necessarily get out with that piece of paper. Whereas at Seattle Pacific, the average cost that people spend is about $32,000 a year. I know that that is not their sticker price, and we're going to talk more about that. But they go for 4 years, they spend $128,000, and they got out in 4 years. Okay. Part of the thing I always tell people is just because it looks cheaper originally doesn't always mean it's going to be the cheapest school on your list by the time you are done. Okay. Now, our goals in this process are always to say we want to get a private education at a public education price. Sometimes we can do better than that. And if we're looking at public schools too, that's totally fine. Remember, I'm a Western grad. I'm not against the public schools. We just like to still do it at the lowest possible cost. Now, talking about student positioning, really, this is where we take all of those attributes of our students and we match them with what they're looking for in a school. And then we always say, you know what, it would also be really nice to get some money and discounts in the process. So, of course, the first thing we have to talk about is the SAT and the ACT. So, the good news is the colleges do not care which test you take. They look at SAT and ACT equally. So what I will have my students do often at the end of sophomore year is when we start this process is what we call an SAT ACT diagnostic test. So what it is a 3.5-hour exam that splits the results for SAT versus ACT with where a student is at right now. It is all online. I email it over to families. The students sit at home, pretend like they're taking a real test. As soon as they complete it, I get an email with the results. So then we can see that baseline score for which one they have that aptitude for and say, okay, you are ACT. Now let's figure out when you should get registered, what you're going to do to study, and what a goal score is that you can reach based on the results. So you really have an outline in regards to what you need to do to study for the test that you are the best at. And so often the number one thing that I will hear from students when they've done a diagnostic test is content-wise, they're pretty similar in terms of the test, but the structure and the style and how they ask the questions is really what differs. So kids will say, you know what, one just made more sense to me than another in how they ask the questions. ACT is also a faster paced test. So sometimes when kids have trouble with timing, that can be an issue, but not always. And so that's why we do the diagnostic in order to get that clarity on what they need to be doing. If your student is a junior, then I have kids doing that throughout junior year. We recommend at the kind of end of sophomore year, beginning of junior year to really launch that whole testing component, because it does give your student the most time to kind of get testing done in junior year rather than having to push it into senior year. Now, when I talk about the scores on these, we always like to talk about the sweet spot. So ACT is out of a 36, kind of a good range to be in is a 27, 28 to a 32. The SAT is out of a 1600, and the equivalency roughly on that is going to be about a 1250 to a 1450. Now, I come up with that because a lot of schools are going to start to fall in that range, and that gives the students an opportunity to be the strongest at academically at their schools when they start to fall in that window. However, it really can vary. So, if they really love a Gonzaga and Gonzaga wants them to have a 1450 on their SAT, it also starts to give them an incentive to study towards that goal for what the institutions want of them. Now, when it comes to the writing portion on these tests, as of June of 2021, the SAT is getting rid of their writing portion. And so we've been telling families, don't worry about getting registered for the writing actual essay for either the SAT or the ACT at this point. The colleges are not going to be requiring them going forward in the fall. So it's just one less thing that your students need to worry about. Now, I always joke with students in the fact is studying for these important? Because usually the number one question I get from kids is, well, Crystal, do I really have to? I've been hearing a lot of schools in general have been going test optional. So is this really even relevant for me? And I always like to make this distinction as well. For schools that are going test optional, that is often for admissions. And so you could very well get into a university without an SAT or ACT score. But what a lot of schools put emphasis on these scores for is often giving merit money or discounts. And so if we really value getting money from our universities, then I do tell kids that it's worth taking your test. If you have a strong score, it can only benefit you. So making sure that you're putting in that time and effort to study is super important. And I really don't care how students do it. If you're motivated enough to use a book, that's great. We get access to ePrep, which is an online video tutorial based program. But if you know you're not going to do anything unless you sit with a tutor or in a class, then so be it. This is just really one of those things where the more time we put into it, the more of a return we can have in terms of our score. So even when we talk to the test prep companies to kind of put it into perspective, they'll say, hey, on the ACT, if you want to increase by 1 point, expect to put in about 10 hours of study in order to do so. So when we then see our baseline on the diagnostic test, it also gives us a good indicator to say, okay, I'm at a 27, my goal is a 30, so how much time do I really need to put into studying, right? So it makes it more realistic for them. Now, this is an article, it's been running around for a while, but it's Claremont McKenna in California. And I really just like to share this with families because it just goes back to understanding the importance that colleges put on test scores and why. So this is an administrator that got caught faking an SAT score for the university, therefore, of course, had to resign. But I always ask families then, why in the world would somebody risk their livelihood to fake an SAT score for a university? Like, what in the world is the school getting out of something like that? And then, of course, the answer is money, right? Like, this is the sad vicious cycle of this process. When we talk about stuff like US News and World Report and Princeton Review, when they do have higher SAT scores, they look better in those rankings. And then that makes alumni happy, and happy alumni often donate money. So it is really just recognizing when we are helping them look better, right, elevating their academics, then the universities themselves are more willing to give us those discounts. And that's why I talk about that distinction between test optional for admissions is not necessarily test optional in terms of getting merit money and discounts. Now, we do know that there is obviously more that makes up our kids than just SAT and ACT score. We also talk about GPA, and The colleges, however, like to see that things are related. So let's just say we've got a 1250 SAT, but a 4.0 GPA. They're going to be like, okay, so did you just take a whole bunch of cupcake classes? Are you really bad at test taking? Or like, what's that story? Can go the other way around and say, okay, well, maybe I have a 3.0 GPA, but I've got a 1500 SAT. They're going to be like, okay, so are you smart and talented when it comes to test taking? Just they like to see that things are correlated between GPA and test score at the end of the day. And so when it comes down to rigor of schedule, the colleges like to see that we're challenging ourselves, but they also like to see that we're still doing well. And I went to one of those panels that they host at the high schools, and some colleges were there, one of which was Brown. And a student asked Brown, should I get an A in a regular class or a B in an AP class? And Brown was like, we want you to get an A in an AP class. So it just kind of put into perspective, right? Like the really challenging schools to get into will often have that really high expectation. But for the most part, we're just talking about making sure that you're managing your schedule of, if you're more of a math science kid, take those AP classes or whatever's available to you. But, don't feel like you have to take all of them, or, don't take English and history if you know that's going to tank your GPA. So being smart about those choices. Extracurricular activities. This is something that you have as an opportunity to share with the colleges what you're going to be up to when you step foot on campus. So this is just recognizing we can be creative in what it is that we're looking at doing. Extracurricular activities don't just have to be school-sponsored events. So often I will have kids take advantage of a variety of different things, or using their community, or getting to job shadow different parents in fields that they're interested in studying. All of that is super valuable. Diversity, this is something that I think of college as a business, right? Like it's big college, it's big pharma, it's big tobacco. We're giving the universities a lot of money. And when it comes down to this whole process of everything, college, the diversity factor too is that it's not just ethnic diversity, it's geographic diversity. When colleges have to check certain boxes to try to say that they've got more kids from different parts of the country, that can help them, right? So them as a business, there's a lot of stuff that they're doing that we just don't, often parents and families don't understand in this process. And so things that we need to think about. Student interest here, if we use examples, I like to use examples. So let's just say we go visit Whitman over in Walla Walla, and we go and visit, we're wearing the Whitman sweatshirt and the Whitman hat, and everybody knows that you're in love with this school. Okay, well, let's just say we've got another kid equally smart, but he's like, you know what, this school is cool, but I could see myself at Willamette and Lewis and Clark and a handful of others. Where does the rubber really meet the road in this process, guys? Is it when we find out if we get in, or is it when we find out how much money we get? Okay, if we think about those two kids, who does the college have to give more money to in order to get them to come? Mr. Rah-Rah or the other guy? Right? They probably know that they've got Rah-Rah hook, line, and sinker, like that they could probably charge him more to go there and he'd pay. Whereas the other one that has a little bit more opportunities and things to pick from, schools to pick from, can benefit us. So part of it too is just recognizing the colleges do like to see that we're interested in them, but we can take it so far as having a one and only, or just being an application, and we like being somewhere in between. Now, essays for applications, I usually pick on kids about this one too. And I'm like, yeah, and who should write them? And usually the parents are always like, the kids. But the reality is, right, this just comes down to making sure it is edited and reviewed, but their voice still needs to come through on that. That's super important. Now I have this other thing on here that says, well, what is that one thing that can still be dramatically changed in this process? And it really does just come back down to SAT and ACT, guys. Here, sometimes we have stuff that impacted our GPA and it never recovers. But you can share that story with the university. And I've seen then a strong SAT or ACT score offset a low GPA, or sometimes vice versa. So it is really just recognizing, though, that you have the power to study for this and put that intention in. Because sometimes at some point in our academic career, right, like things are what they are. We're not going to go add a whole bunch of activities. Maybe there's not a lot we can do to change our GPA, right? So it is the thing that we do have available to us. Now, we've talked about kind of some of that stuff that makes up our kids, and then we're going to marry that with what we're looking for in our schools. And here I talk more behind the scenes. We're not going to dive into, is it West Coast, East Coast, what kind of majors do they have today? It's more the stuff that you need to know and understand that people don't talk about. But I do like to show you guys David Letterman style, how you really pick your schools. And I pick on the students first, right? Boyfriend, girlfriend, all of my friends are going. We know that is sad, but true. Education is cool. That is often stuff like California, because, the sun. And it's a party school. Don't tell my dad. Good sports teams, right? That definitely has merit, especially if we want to play a sport. But my disclaimer is we still have to make sure that if we get hurt or we can't play, that we still like our school. Parents, though, you are super easy, right? Money is always at the top of the brain. And then quality of education, we definitely do want that. I went there. I do get a lot of parental pride in the mix. And then any school within 2 hours drive of home, this is often mom. And then window sticker. So that's just the pure vanity, right? Like Princeton's going to look really good on the back of my BMW. Also sad, but true sometimes. This, though, is my corny canned answer. So this is just something I would be tickled to hear from a kid. I would love to attend XYZ University. It's a great opportunity for me to study biology or history. And in fact, this university is well known for its outstanding faculty, and it is credited for being one of the best universities at which to study biology or history. And by the way, they offer the best financial aid package in comparison to their short list of competitors. This is my statement. Really, though, there's two things going on here, guys. One, the student already has an idea of what they're interested in studying before they step foot on campus. Now, I am not saying that your kid needs to know that they want to be a mechanical engineer, but I am saying if they don't have programs that they're interested in, why in the world are they attending in the first place? And then they say that they offer the best financial aid package in comparison to their competitors. The reality is we know all colleges are just in competition, but then there's also the short list. There's always the same kind of kids applying to the same kind of schools. So we have that as an opportunity to take advantage of as well. Now, some of these attributes of schools that I want you to understand for today is this first one is called enrollment yield. So here, this is how many acceptance letters do they have to send out in order to get butts in seats on the first day of school? So how many are they actually enrolling in their institution? So let's just use Hiram in Ohio as an example. Now, usually when I ask people, when I teach this class live, I get like 1 out of 10 classes that I teach where are families from the Midwest. And so they've heard of Hiram. And so I always like to kind of hit that point too, is to say, well, now the fact that none of you really have heard of this school, does that say anything about the quality of education there? And I shake my head and I go, everybody should go like this and say, no, Crystal. The reality is there are thousands of schools out there. And so if they don't have a quality problem at Hiram, they have a marketing problem. They're in Ohio, we're in Washington. Okay, well, then they might have to work a little bit harder in order to get kids to come from Washington to Ohio. So what do? Let's just say they have to send out 8,000 letters to get 2,000 butts in seats. That's an enrollment yield of 25%. So what do they have to do to convince that 25% to come to their school? They go, okay, well, my sticker price is $63,455 at Hiram, but congratulations, here's the honorary medal scholarship award, and now it's only $32,455. Welcome to Hiram. Really, all they've done is they said, this is my cost. I like you, so now here's your discount. Okay. Now, when schools have a lower enrollment yield, it can also then indicate that we have an opportunity in terms of getting discounts then in that fashion. Enrollment management, though, plays into this as well. So this is still yet again talking about their enrollment. Now, typically you guys have been taught there's admissions. They tell me if I get in, financial aid tells me how much money I get. The reality is enrollment management is the hat that lives above those two. Their job is to say, well, what is the best incoming freshman class that I want for my school? Sounds like admissions. And how much money do I have to give them to convince them to come? Sounds like financial aid. So it makes sense to marry those two things together in this process. And this is not new, guys. This has been around since the 1980s, and colleges have just gotten really good at it. Really, this is what it is. It's math. So they use logistical regression and statistics where they can take families that look just like you from the past and predict how much they think it's going to take to convince you to come to their institution. So this is why we also talk about enrollment management in terms of the college as a business side of things, because this is something where when we think about schools, right, then it's their money, it's their discretion. They're choosing to give it to us on a lot of different factors. And it's not nearly as black and white as people think it is. Of course, the intention is that we want to ensure that the college is going to want our student badly enough to consider discounting down the price in order to get them to come. Now here, this is my rule of thumb, guys. If you make sure your student is in the top 25% of the incoming freshman class when it comes to that university's SAT or ACT scores, then you are going to be best positioning your student in terms of getting those discounts. Okay. Now, some rules of thumb in this process, we say to use a top-down approach. Really what we mean by that is there are thousands of schools out there, and we really need to narrow it down to the 6 to 10 that we're interested in. The problem is never information nowadays, because you can get that everywhere. But usually the number one thing that I hear from families is, Crystal, this is overwhelming. I don't even know where to start. Or my kid is in that same bucket. They just don't even know where to start because they don't know what they're interested in. They don't know where they're even looking. And I totally understand. And that's part of, in my world, why we do what we call a comprehensive college search. We're really looking at it more from where are schools the best academic fit, the best social fit, and best financial fit. So we're using more that wisdom of what it is that we want out of our school in these different ways in order to really get down to those 6 to 10 schools that we consider to be within our wheelhouse. And I look at schools a little bit differently. Most of you guys have probably heard this kind of thing from counseling offices or family or friends or what have you is, well, your students should apply to like a safety school and a handful of target schools and a whole bunch of reach schools. And I don't live by that philosophy, because if it's a reach school, it's a reach school for a reason. If you're barely getting in, are you likely to be getting any money in order to go? And the answer is not so much. So sometimes we give up one thing for another. And I am not here to kill dreams, right? If your student has some schools that are a reach on their list, that's totally fine. My request is, though, we don't have our entire list made up of those kinds of schools. When we say wheelhouse, the reality is, in my world, I think that it should be a given for a student to get into a university, and it should be more that question of how much money is the school going to give them in order to go there. And then being willing to travel from the West Coast can dramatically cut the cost. And I always like to emphasize this for people because often they think that they need to stay in their state or not go far because if they do, it's going to be more expensive. And that's not necessarily true. I have kids every year where when they look outside of the West Coast, discount opportunities come. And the last couple of years, I actually had two kids at the University of Missouri. It's one of the best schools in the country in terms of journalism, which happens to be what they were both really interested in. And with the discounts that they got and then in-state tuition, it's actually cheaper for them to attend there than it was for them to even stay in Washington and attend our state schools. I also had kids the last couple of years as well. Long Island University and gave full ride for tuition. So it's just one of those things that just like if you had that mental kind of block of, well, we can't look outside of our state because it's going to be more expensive. That's not true. We want you to understand that you can look at schools as long as they're a good academic fit, and depending on the kind of monies they give, there can be opportunities to be able to make it affordable. And then, of course, looking at retention and graduation rates. Retention, we just want to know how many students are returning sophomore year. And graduation rates, as we were talking about earlier, it's just not a given to get out of schools in 4 years anymore. So making sure that we're really positioning ourselves based on the opportunities. And I always like to talk about UW as an example for this too, is if you are interested in computer science and engineering, if you don't get directly admitted into that program at University of Washington, then you shouldn't be attending there because they will flat out say, don't expect to stay here for 2 years and then apply to that program and get in. So then it's going to cost you more time and more money. So you should be looking at schools where you're going to get directly into your program and therefore make sure that you can still graduate on time. Now to take a turn and talk more about the financials, here, this is just a comic that's been running around. We've got mom and dad saying, move back home. Kids today are so lazy and irresponsible. Your mother and I started out with nothing. And then we've got the kid going, trust me, I would have loved starting out with nothing. And really, we know the moral to the story is that we don't want our kids to go be a bad student loan statistic, but we can use student loans in a positive way as well. I believe that it can give kids skin in the game and have some accountability to get done in 4 years. And it also buys you time, right? You have an opportunity to continue to save and help them to pay for however much it is that you agreed to when they have a successful 4-year graduation. Now, this is just a look in regards to some of the local college costs right now. So this is all in, right? Tuition, room and board, usually some form of books and miscellaneous fees. So you can see UW is at about $28,000 a year. I think on the high end on this one, we've got Whitman is about $69,000, and then Eastern is about $23,000. But really the most important thing on here is the statistic. 25% of all public college students will graduate in 4 years. National average is at 6.24 years for a 4-year degree, which is why we talk about graduation. Like I said, not always a given to get out. So making sure that we're picking schools in that best fit overall is super beneficial. Now, when it comes to financial positioning, the good news is there is money out there. The bad news is that people lose out on it in a couple of primary ways. One is not filling out financial aid forms correctly. The primary thing I will see here is that people will say, well, Crystal, I think I reported my retirement as an investment on the financial aid forms. Was I supposed to do that? And I'm like, no, you weren't supposed to do that. So it really, a lot of this comes into understanding the rules and the strategy when it comes to these financial aid forms. And so I compare this really to taxes. So most people will have an accountant because they will say, you know what, here is based on the rules of the federal government, right? This is your tax liability and this is how we can reduce it down. people like me on the college planning side, we go, okay, well, these are the rules that we've also been given by the federal government, and this is the strategies and the stuff that we can use on our side to reduce down your college expectation. So in terms of how much we would have to pay. So it's that same concept. We've got rules and strategies that we're given that we can use in this process. And then looking in the wrong places for money, we're going to talk about where the big money is, so that's really where we put forth our effort. And then procrastinating until senior year. Really, this just comes back to understanding that deadlines have moved to be a lot earlier. And I think that it's still taken a really long time for people to kind of process that their students should be really having all of this stuff done at the very beginning of their senior year. So that's part of starting this process as a freshman, as a sophomore. It's not early anymore. You are on time, especially on the financial component. I will regularly have families reach out to me with freshmen because they go, Crystal, I don't know how I'm going to pay for this. Like, I need more help on this than I thought I did. And it's totally understandable. So just earlier you start this process, the less stressful it really is overall as well. Now, financial aid is based on a few different things. First, we primarily think of like needs. So how much money do I make? How much money do I have saved? And then all the stuff that's the merit of my student, grades, test scores, etc. But then I have this other category on here, and I'm just going to tell you that it's money. So what I mean by that, we'll use an example, is to say if you have two families that are the same and academic students are the same, but one family has $100,000 in the bank and the other one has zero, who does the college have to give more money to in order to convince them to come? And usually this is when I get blank stares from people and they're like, Crystal, is this a trick question? I'm like, no, it really isn't. You know, the answer is the one with zero. And this is just going back to the enrollment management conversation. And this is where colleges are looking at this to say, well, if you have $100,000, you have 100,000 abilities to pay the university more than somebody who doesn't. So yet again, where it becomes more of that gray category, students are the same academically, but one has an ability to pay more than another, the university may not feel they need to give as much of a discount in order to get that student to come. Now, where is the money at and how do I get it? The biggest chunk you're going to see on here is 26% in federal loans. We're not aiming for that. We want the free money. And that's that next biggest bucket on here is 28% is institutional grants. And really this is, it is what it sounds. It's money coming from an institution going directly to you. The irony is that this is often the biggest bucket of money that is missed by people because it goes back to my rule of thumb. You want to make sure your student is in that top 25% of the incoming freshman class in order to maximize getting the most in terms of that bucket. Now, if we look at this chart, what is the one thing that is so small and so insignificant it didn't make it on here, but everybody always talks about it? Okay, this is scholarships. So now I always like to define the word scholarship. This is often the $500 Rotary Scholarship, the 2000 BECU Scholarship, the I went and hit my counseling office up scholarship. I am not saying don't do it. I'm saying know when it's beneficial and know when it's not. So if you say, Crystal, I'm applying to a whole bunch of state schools, I'm going to say you should go hit up your counseling office because that's going to be one of the best opportunities for you to get some discounts is by applying for those scholarships. But if you say, Crystal, I'm looking at some in-state, some out-of-state, some public, some private, I'm going to tell you you're best off positioning yourself at the institutions and getting the biggest monies from them. Because often institutions would be the ones that are giving $20,000 versus getting a $2,000 scholarship. I like extra zeros. Now, they also have a calculation for all of this. So sometimes when we go out and get some of those outside scholarships, it can reduce down how much money the institution will give us. So here is an example of that. So here we look at the COA, which is the cost of attendance and the sticker price of schools we were looking at earlier, minus the EFC. So that is the expected family contribution. It is how much the government is saying you can afford to pay for school when you fill out the financial aid forms. So when you subtract one from the other, you're going to get a need. And if you go get a resource like a scholarship, then the university can modify your need. So here you can see we have the example of a school that cost $38,000 a year. This family's expected family contribution was 24. So then the difference between the two was what we needed of 14. And then they went and got that 2000 Rotary scholarship. And so that's where most families are like, great, that means I have $2,000 less that I have to pay for school. Not necessarily. What the university can do is they can say, okay, well, I'm going to modify your need from 14 down to 12. So now me as an institution, I only need to give you 12 grand to come to my school. Congratulations, you just saved the college money. Now, one of the things I always tell families then to ask is when you talk to a school, get confirmation of whether they allow you to get then outside scholarships and how it impacts. As well, for those students that are 2023 or beyond, the EFC or the expected family contribution will be referred to as the SAI or Student Aid Index. In January of 2021, they made an announcement that there's going to be changes in regards to the calculation and the name that it is referred to. So we are just working with families one-on-one in regards to how those changes will or will not impact them going forward. Now, there are a few different financial aid forms in this process. The first one is the FAFSA, so that's the Federal Application for Student Aid. Here, we want to make sure that we are filling it out in a timely fashion. That is October of a student's senior year. And they do what we call a 2-year look back in regards to your taxes. So if your student is a 2023 grad, they will be looking at your 2021 tax year. So part of that strategy as well is looking at what do we have that is hitting our taxes for that first year that we are applying for financial aid. Our goal is always we want to look as dirt poor on paper as we can. So if we have an ability to shift things around, or I've had people where they're selling off stock options or they've gotten inheritances, etc. So we just try to better plan for that financial picture and what the colleges are going to see. And then we also have the CSS profile, and then the colleges will have institutional specific financial aid forms as well. So just know, depending on the university, there can be up to 3 financial aid forms. My rule of thumb is that you always fill out these forms. The number one thing that I hear from families is, Crystal, I'm not going to qualify for financial aid. And I think that this is something that people really need to understand, is that colleges, it's their money. They get to determine to give it to you or not. Filling out the financial aid forms is just a prerequisite for this. So just because you make high 6 figures and does not mean you are out of the running and getting monies from the universities. But it's understanding, right? Like, it's a federal form, but it's the institutions interpreting that form. So I even have families that are not citizens. They still fill out the financial aid form because that's still the information that's getting sent to the universities for them to determine often even their own merit money that they are going to give. Now, some schools will also have college-specific scholarship forms, and this is another thing a lot of families don't realize, is that often scholarships are hosted at a university somewhere. And so I think of WSU as a great example. When you fill out your application for admissions, in that portal is also a scholarship application. So all of those people that said, I love the communications program, etc., at WSU, they then put in all of this money, and the university has one scholarship form that students fill out in order to get put in for all of those. So that's also a great opportunity to take advantage of, and a lot of the state schools do stuff like that. But often if we are divorced, if we have businesses, there can be other things that go along with this whole process. But remember, your rule of thumb is that you always want to fill out your financial aid forms in a timely fashion, which is October of senior year. Now here, this example says private versus public. It really doesn't matter in terms of the type of school. This is just starting to recognize if we need it based on the financial aid calculation, that a school is actually giving it to us. So here you can see we have a school that costs $30,000 a year. This family's expected family contribution was 10. So then the difference between the two is what they needed of 20. And then this university, you can see, gave us 100% of what we need. And 80% of that was in the form of free money and 20% was in the form of a loan. So when we add it all back up, it was $10,000 for our EFC, $4,000 for our loan. It was $14,000 for what was originally a $30,000 a year school. Now, the other side, we've got the school that cost $18,000. Our EFC stays the same at 10, so we only need 8. But then the school gapped us. They shorted us what we needed in order to go. And then what they did give us was only $2,000 in the form of free money and $2,000 in the form of a loan. So when we add that all back up, it was $16,000 a year for what was originally an $18,000 a year school. So yet again, still goes back to just because it looks cheaper doesn't always mean it is by the time we're done. So especially if we need it, right, we want to make sure then that we're getting the most of that filled, and not all schools do that. Now, this is starting to dive a little bit more into the strategy component and talking about the FAFSA. And here you can see I have family A and family B. And really everything is the same, as you can see, in terms of income and savings. The only thing different is their expected family contribution. And that's just because family A was just like, hey, I know I need to fill out financial aid forms. It's October of senior year. And they just filled it out as it was, and they didn't think about strategies and how they could best position themselves. Whereas family B was like, okay, so tell me how we can use these strategies. Can I reduce down my expected family contribution and changing anything in my financial picture? So we analyzed their information and we discovered, yes, we could reduce down our expected family contribution from $19,000 to a little over $8,200 a year. That's about 10 grand, right? For 4 years. So that would have been $40,000 more that we just spent on college than we had to. So I always tell people, yes, it is important to understand what your expected family contribution is, but it's equally important to understand what it means to different kinds of schools and our opportunity to actually get money and discounts from them accordingly. Because a lot of families that I work with as well, their expected family contributions are really high, especially if you have a 2-income household. And so recognizing that it's college selection and the kinds of monies that a student can get from a university is just as important. So the expected family contribution really just teaches us something in this process. Now, more in terms of the strategy, there's different kinds of assets on these financial aid forms, and this is what we call an assessable or non-assessable and exempted asset. So part of this is looking at what do we have that is accessible to the colleges that we can make non-accessible or exempt for the sake of financial aid forms. And some families will have opportunities for that and others don't. And then also who owns an asset and how and when it gets used can impact this process. So if a grandparent owns something, a parent owns it, or a student owns it, I effectively think of it like a different tax bracket. If there is money in a student's name, it's actually the worst place for it to be, because the college will say that you can take more of that and it goes towards your expected family contribution. So they think you can afford to pay more for school because it's there. And then understanding that some people have businesses and homes and vacation properties. There are a lot of different ways that we can value stuff. We always want to accurately report, but we do not want to overly report. So just because your house says it's worth $1 million on Zillow doesn't necessarily mean that's the best value to use when it comes to financial aid. And then understanding tax and financial aid ramifications for all of this stuff combined. That's why we said planning early is actually a great idea, because now you're starting to understand, that first year that financial aid form is looked at, the years continuing that they still look at it. If we have changes in our overall picture, if we have multiple kids in school at the same time, right? All things that we want to talk about and take into consideration. Now, as well, when we talk about college, we want to have a plan on how we're going to pay for it. So a college funding plan in our minds should make these check off all of these features really in order to maximize your out-of-pocket costs. So we always say a funding plan should have tax-free growth, tax-free distributions, a great rate of return, high contribution limits, right? So college is expensive and we want to be able to save as much money as we want. And of course, number one, too, is exempt from the financial aid calculations. We don't want to lose any of our money as well. So we don't want it to be at risk like stuff can be in the stock market. And then we want liquidity and control of it. So we can use it when we need to without penalty and being able to pay for college, or just having money left over for retirement if we don't need it all for college. So whenever we're building college funding plans, we make sure that they check off all of these features. But if you don't have that kind of plan in place, then we should definitely talk about how that can be a possibility for you. Now, putting it all together, here's a timeline for junior and senior year. Junior year, really, we start talking about our EFC and making sure that you understand our opportunities in getting monies from our schools. Also, often when we will start putting funding plans in place, but like I said, people will often start that as early as freshman and sophomore year as well. And then we want to do career and aptitude testing. So starting to figure out what our students are really interested in so that that can lead us into what kind of schools are the best fit. PSAT, and this often happens in October of a student's junior year. And this is just an opportunity, if they are a really strong test taker, that they can get put in for national merit opportunities. So colleges actually do give discounts for students that score really high on a PSAT. And then SAT and ACT in junior year, usually the intention is to say, I want to take my test for the first time in fall/winter of junior year. Then if I'm not happy with it, I can take it again in the spring and hopefully be done. And then start our college search, check the status of our high school path. So that's what classes we are taking, find people to write us letters of recommendation. And this is thinking about those people that know you best. Usually we need one academic teacher. And then if you have somebody from work or sport or extracurricular activity, those are also really great options as well. And then start working on a resume and really go do college visits. I think that is super helpful in kids getting to see, is it a small school and a big school? Do I have a preference? What does it mean to be in the city versus the middle of nowhere? Going and stepping foot on college campuses can definitely give students a better insight, and often will help with that "I don't know" statement that you hear all the time. They don't know because they haven't seen it, so we need to show it to them. Senior year, we definitely want to finish strong academically. Colleges will ask for final transcripts, so we want to make sure that we continue strong through the end. And then taking our SAT, ACT in senior year, usually November is kind of like that final window that we look at if we need to take the test. And then continue refining our search, do more visits. And then my rule of thumb with applications is if you smell turkey and you have not filled out those applications yet, that is what those 4 days are for. And then October, like I said, is the FAFSA. It opens October 1st, and it's a good goal to have it done in October. And then shortly thereafter, you're going to have the CSS profile and institutional forms due. And then February to April are it's the primary window that you will start getting your final award letters from your universities, and you make your final acceptance by May 1st, and then you put down your housing deposit and you are on your merry way. Now, some case studies for you to put all of this together as well. Here we've got Alyssa. She was the oldest of 2 kids. You can see she had an SAT score of 1400, but her parents didn't think that private school was an option because they didn't think that they could afford it. Here you can see they had an income of $72,000 a year. They had some money saved up in some various assets. So their first run through of their expected family contribution was $26,000 a year according to the profile, and then $16,000 a year according to the FAFSA, which they did not feel like they could afford. But what we were able to do is we analyzed their information so that they were able to reduce their EFC on the profile from 26 down to 20, and then on the FAFSA from 16 down to 10. Now, she also had some schools that were all a really great fit for her. So Whitman, WSU, Lewis and Clark, Gonzaga, PLU, and Richmond. At the time, Whitman and Lewis and Clark were about $45,000 a year. Whitman gave her $31,000 a year. Lewis and Clark gave her $26,000. So she chose to attend Whitman, paying about $14,000 a year, which is roughly the tuition and fees at UW right now. Now, Rachel, though, here you can see she had an SAT of 1460. Her dilemma, though, was that she was originally only interested in 3 schools. So then she had to go back and do more of what we call the comprehensive college search. She did find 10 that she really liked and applied to. Here, though, you can see they have a high family income of over $350,000. They also had about $300,000 saved up in some assets. So their initial expected family contribution was over $116,000 a year. And then with some work, they were able to get it down to about $95,000 a year. Now, this is where most people will go, well, Crystal, that's great. I don't know of a school that costs $95,000 a year. So often they default to, well, they're just not going to get money in order to go. Not true. What happened for her, though, is she chose to attend Drexel. She got a $34,000 award for what was then a $52,000 a year school. So she went paying about $20,000 out of pocket. She also got an offer, though, from the Illinois Institute of Technology. She could have gone there for just over $9,000 a year, but in the end, she chose Drexel. I also actually had another student a few years ago. Cost had gone up a little bit, but she went to Illinois for architecture. I think she was paying about $15,000 a year. So yet again, kind of the diamonds in the rough, right? Opening the door to possibility, we can find some really great opportunities. But I always like to ask people whenever we're looking at awards like this, like, okay, do you think this was a need-based award or a merit-based award? And usually people are like, well, duh, Crystal, they didn't need it. So it wasn't a need-based award. It was obviously merit. And I'm like, yeah, but do you think that this was really a true merit-based award? And that's usually where people are like, well, what do you mean? And so first, too, we also have to go back and look at, well, how did we reduce down our expected family contribution, right? From 116 down to 95. And it's not really that we reduced it that darn much, right? It's still $95,000 a year. But what we did was we took the $300,000 in terms of assets that they had that was accessible for the college's calculation, and we made it non-accessible or exempt for the sake of the financial aid forms, which, like I said, it's not so much it reduced the expected family contribution, but it goes back to that enrollment management conversation, right? Was this really a pure merit-based award? No, not necessarily, because if we think about it, if we had 2 students, right? If we had Rachel and we had the clone of Rachel, and the clone still had $300,000 sitting there, but they both had equally high income, right? Who does the college have to give more in order to convince them to come? Always goes back to, if you have 300,000 abilities to pay the college more than somebody who has 0, then the college doesn't often feel they need to give you as big of a discount. So this is where that gray category does come in regards to, do you need it? Are you meritorious? Is it really just the college's money and they're just choosing to give it to us, right? Our job is to say that really, we just want to maximize where our student is that best fit and where they can get those monies and discounts in order to attend. And granted, we do see this more from private schools, but I see it from state schools as well. I had a student this last year that got an offer from Montana State Bozeman, where it was a full ride for tuition, room and board, and a grant to do research, like 100% fully paying for him to come to that school. That is a state school, but his academics were so strong that they're trying to convince him to go there versus going somewhere else. right? So yet again, it's the college's discretion. So we want to make sure then that we understand this whole process, yet academic and financial fit is a super important thing. Now, to wrap everything up, I always tell people they need to be thinking about two things. The first is, what is my EFC? And along with it, do I have the opportunity to reduce it? And if so, how? And the second is, what schools are going to be that great fit for my student, have the programs they want, and set them up to success to graduate in 4 years. So, what I offer to do is meet with families for what we call a 45-minute FAFSA review. I do charge $99 for that initial consultation, and the value that you get out of our time together is well worth the cost. In our meeting, we will talk about your students' academics and your family's finances so that you better understand what kinds of schools you can get money to go to, and of course, answer any questions that you may have. So, click on the link below to schedule a consultation today, and in there, you're also going to find the information on how to prepare for that meeting as well as the Zoom link. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I look forward to talking with you soon.